And welcome to this special Wednesday edition of Ask an Advocate, brought to you today by the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence and our sister organization, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape. And today we're going to be talking about domestic violence and sexual assault in queer relationships, barriers faced by LGBTQ survivors, and working with LGBTQ youth to prevent dating violence. And we're also going to touch on the current policy climate in Pennsylvania in regards to some of the relevant legislation that's been happening lately. So joining us today for these discussions, we have Leo Bake. Leo, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, yeah, thanks so much, Lauren. My name is Leo Bake. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a former LGBTQIA+ outreach advocate for the Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. I've been working with survivors of domestic and intimate partner violence, specifically in the LGBTQ community, for a couple of years now, probably about 5 years now, facilitating support groups and just doing like trauma-informed care and things like that. So I've done a lot of work with LGBTQIA youth. I'm pretty connected to the Pittsburgh community. So I'm really happy to be able to share my expertise here today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Leo. And we also have Rachael Mills. Rachael, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Muted myself because the cats were yelling. Hi, I'm Rachael Mills. I'm a staff attorney with PCAR's Sexual Violence Legal Assistance Project, and so we, are on the sort of flip of the coin from DV stuff. We do sexual assault, Title IX representation, things of that nature across the state. And I live with my wife and my kid in Philadelphia, and so I'm happy to bring in, the opposite viewpoint from Leo, where we've got both sides of the state, the only two that people live in, as far as I can tell. Just kidding. I'm a recent transplant from Central PA, so I can say that, I feel like.
Yeah, I totally get it.
I guess I'm repping the middle today. And we also have Mallory Mitchell with us. Mallory, would you introduce yourself too?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mallory. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Prevention and Evaluation Coordinator here at PCAR. So working with our prevention team to help our centers with their education and outreach. I have a background in human sexuality education, so a lot of different aspects of teaching the youngins and teaching the older adults all about anything sex ed or relationship based. Super excited to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your participation. So historically, LGBTQ survivors' voices and experiences were unfortunately largely left out of conversations about domestic violence and sexual assault, but sexual assault and domestic violence, as we know, affect individuals of all genders, all sexualities, and in fact, members of the LGBTQ community experience higher rates of sexual victimization, and intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community occurs at a rate equal to or even higher than that of the heterosexual community. Yet even these statistics may not really tell us the full story. So I wanted to ask, what are some of the gaps that you have seen in research that we should be taking into account when we talk about the prevalence of both intimate partner violence and sexual assault within the LGBTQ communities?
Yeah, so from my experience, the biggest issue with the gaps in research is that it's not, it doesn't cover all of the demographics of people to be really indicative of the numbers of people who are actually experiencing intimate partner violence or sexual assault. And so what I mean by that is that it's very binary. So the statistics are very binary. The statistics are very white. And so, we have data on transgender men and transgender women specifically. And, even that data is fairly outdated. I think the most recent up to date we have on that is 2017. That's based off of the 2015 transgender national survey. So we've got this very binary, very white-centric data that is, it's not inclusive of any kind of gender queer, non-binary, gender non-conforming identity, as well as, you know, Black or Indigenous queer trans people. You know, there's a whole spectrum of sexualities that kind of get left out under that like other category, right? So that's also a piece of data that's missing. You know, and if you think about all of the like, you know, ability status and things like that too. So there's just a really large percentage of people who are just not being included in the research to begin with. So there's, you know, therefore not a whole lot of resources to kind of, you know, look at, well, what can we do to help create new resources for people? And so that lack of data and information just it causes these huge gaps in resource and accessibility.
Thanks, Leo. What are some of the reasons that these gaps in research exist?
I think a big part of the reason why the gaps kind of exist, so it's kind of a tiered response, right? So there are, as we kind of, well, as we kind of progress forward, right, in our understandings of gender and sexuality, and, you know, we start to differentiate that, yes, gender and sex are two different things. We have all of these differing identities that are kind of, you know, get kind of left out of the conversation. So to add trans men and trans women in 2015 was very progressive, right? But it's kind of stagnated since then. And so there's, you know, kind of just a lack of attention to the different identities and things. There, you know, there are a lot of misconceptions that queer people do not experience domestic or intimate partner violence or sexual assault. There's a lack of understanding that there are such limited inaccessible resources to people. So it's a lot of just, and I think miscommunication is too light of a word to use, but it's a lot of just ignorance to who needs resources and why it's important that these different groups of people actually receive those resources.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And, you know, like resources are finite within any kind of nonprofit, like service provision. And so if we can identify that these folks are out there and that they're in need of services as well, the money's not going to get allocated to help those individuals, especially if they need specialized services. So especially you mentioning, you know, like different abilities and Black and Brown queer folks, you know, there might be some specific needs that they have. So in light of that, like, while, you know, we know that all domestic violence is about power and control in relationships, but there are some distinct tactics and signs of abuse that may exist within queer relationships. So can you talk a little bit about what some of those major differences might be that advocates or friends and family might see in a queer relationship?
Sure, yeah. So I think, you know, so we talk a lot about, even in like advocacy training, right? There's a lot of information about how gender is really integral to why domestic violence happens and why it works, right? And so I think gender plays even bigger role in queer trans relationships when it comes to any kind of relationship violence. So, you know, if you think about just conceptions of masculinity and femininity, and even androgyny too, you know, these certain specific ideas that we attribute to each of those categories. So, right, this idea that men are perpetrators of abuse because men are masculine and aggressive, right? But we know that, you know, men can also be survivors or victims of a sexual assault or domestic violence. And so, you know, if we think about the example I kind of always give is if we have a lesbian couple and one person is very masculine presenting and one person is very femme, and, you know, let's just say for argument's sake that the very femme person is of smaller stature, maybe the more masculine presenting person is a little taller, right? Whenever you think about their, and the more masculine presenting partner is the person who's experiencing the abuse. If the police are called in that situation, what often happens is that the aggressor, the role of the aggressor is going to be put on that masculine person, because it's this idea that masculinity equals abusive or aggressive. And so that's a really huge part of it, right? I mean, and this is true for, if you think about trans women, especially if you think about Black trans women, there's, you have to think about, okay, well, there's the angry Black woman stereotype. So if this woman is able to pass, right? There's that stigma that kind of gets placed on her, or, maybe if from the perspective of law enforcement, she doesn't pass, can just kind of corresponding with the, the tension that exists between law enforcement and Black people in America. That's going to be something that's going to put her at risk. And so there's so many kind of different factors. So I think gender is a really big one for sure. And there's a lot of barriers to service. And so that becomes, again, because of this myth of mutuality, that queer and trans people kind of don't have abusive relationships, but that they have these toxic relationships, right? We throw around the word toxic in a kind of interesting capacity, as in like both of these people are fault. And that's not really how abuse works, right? When we think about, the definition of abuse is one person using coercive power and control over another person. And so that is always going to be the case. And so what we kind of find often in queer relationships is that, one person may be responding to the abuse in a way that looks abusive. So often, especially with queer trans people are often kind of fighting for identity. There's a lot of fight response, right? So when we think about fight, flight, or freeze, that fight response is going to be really, really prominent in relationships where there's any kind of, aggression or any kind of like high velocity of the relationship, say. So it's gonna be perceived as mutual abuse, where in fact one person is trying to survive the abuse through the mimicking of the actions of the other person.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So we do have a lot of advocates that participate in these events, and so I wanted to touch on a little bit how advocates and even like medical professionals and other potential points of access to domestic violence services or sexual assault services can use some of that knowledge about like the differences in queer relationships and some of the abuse tactics that might be used. How can they use that knowledge to improve things like IPV screening and service provision for those folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at its very base, I think the most important thing is understanding that when you screen or when you do domestic violence screenings for LGBTQIA folks, it's important to focus and listen for context and listen for the intent of the action, right? Just, a barrier to service that happens for a lot of queer people is that the aggressor in the situation will attempt to get to the services before the person who actually needs the services. And so what happens is that agencies will end up serving the aggressor, and then the person who actually needs the services, when they finally come to try to receive the services, it's a point of conflict. And so we can't work with them, right? And so I think it's really important to be really mindful of the questions that you're asking, right? And to be really mindful of personal biases, right? We all have personal biases. It's really easy to get caught up in that narrative of like, oh, this person is telling me like their story, and therefore what they say, it must be absolutely true, right? Like we are so, obviously we want to believe survivors, but it's really important that we're not missing the people who really need the services, and we're not missing or excluding the people who maybe haven't come forward yet. So just listening and thinking about your own biases in your screening. Understand that screening for queer and trans couples is going to look different than it might for heterosexual or cisgender couples, right? Taking the idea of gender into consideration, taking into consideration that there are going to be several layers of trauma that come from marginalized identity, as opposed to just thinking about somebody who might be white and cisgender and heterosexual and who has experienced abuse, but who is not also working through the trauma of, microaggressions from being a Black or Indigenous or a brown person, or, discrimination from being a queer person, or maybe the person that this individual has already spoken to in the agency has used microaggressions against them. And so they're coming into this with a little bit more hesitation than somebody else might, right? And so just being really mindful of the language that you're using. And, we talk a lot about like cultural competency and things like that, and especially in social work. And so I think that is a really important aspect to making sure that, these people can feel supported and that the screening processes are being really effective and utilized appropriately.
Lou, you mentioned some of the barriers that LGBTQ survivors might face when seeking services. Can you dive a little bit more deeply into that and talk a little more in detail about what those barriers look like and what also advocates can do to help reduce some of those barriers for survivors seeking services?
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit already, but discrimination from service providers, right? This kind of like looking at somebody and deeming them, not deserving of the service just because of whatever it is, whether it's that myth of mutuality or, again, personal biases, right? So discrimination is a really huge one. Often, and this is kind of changing a little bit, but there's no mention of LGBTQI plus partner abuse in outreach materials on social media. When people go to tabling events and things like that, it kind of gets left out of the conversation. So not doing outreach that's really in-depth and inclusive of those individuals can be a huge barrier to service. They may not even know that, that service is an option for them, right? So that's huge. LGBTQIA folks are super less likely to get PFAs, protection from abuse orders, or to call the police for assistance in cases of extreme violence, just because of, what I was talking a little bit about earlier about this kind of just lack of training, lack of understanding, general tension that exists between law enforcement and, the LGBTQIA community. And of course, obviously, Black community, Black queer and trans people, Indigenous queer and trans people, and so on, right? So that's huge. Oftentimes there's not a lot of consequence or anything that kind of comes from harassment or discrimination of queer folks. So we can train ourselves, we can train advocates to, to have kindness and show compassion and not let those biases come through in the work. We can't always do that with residents, right? So if we have emergency shelters and, if something happens, an instance happens and somebody is harassing or using discrimination against somebody who is queer or trans, oftentimes what will happen is the queer or the trans person will get relocated to a hotel, and that sends the message that it's okay to continue doing that and to continue interacting with people in that way because you've removed the person who is experiencing the hurt, right? And so, it's easy to just flip that script, right? We don't want to kick people out because obviously if they're in the shelter, they're there for a reason, right? And there are ways to go about doing that in a really like safe way that also tell people like, we're not going to be tolerant of behavior that's going to harm people in that way. So that's definitely a huge portion of it. Just kind of like with the outreach materials and no mention, a lot of binary language in organizational names or social media or curricula or, you know, whatever it is, right? The domestic violence movement started in the 1980s with that second wave of feminism. And so it's really been historically centered around white women, right? And that's a really great thing. It's kind of where our foundations come from. And we need to make sure that we are also including other groups of people, other demographics of people who need to be involved in that conversation. And honestly, it's really easy to kind of adjust to these things, right? It's really easy to be inclusive. It can be as simple as asking your staff to put pronouns in your email signature, or asking staff to wear pronoun pins, or, you know, giving them the option to do so without making them feel like weird about it, right? Hanging up posters, pride flags, right? A lot of very just like simple cover your bases kind of stuff, right? Ensuring that clients are being called by their legal or their names that they've been asked, that they've asked to be called, right? Oftentimes advocates don't need to have access to their legal name. If you need the legal name for court cases or anything like that, right? Obviously, legal advocates or lawyers can have access to that information. That still does not mean that those people need to be called that name, right? If they've requested, you know, that they like to be called XYZ and their legal name is something different, that's a conversation that needs to be had. Asking clients for their pronouns, updating intake forms so that all of this information is there and they know that, you know, nobody's going to be invasive of their privacy or their identity is really helpful. And honestly, you know, just surveying the readiness of your staff to see, you know, where they stand as far as being able to serve LGBTQIA+ clients, right? And sending out surveys that, you know, speak to, you know, have you ever worked with queer people before? Have you ever met a trans person before? Especially when we talk about, you know, kind of, right, we've kind of joking around about Pittsburgh, Philadelphia on the end, but there are a lot of rural areas in the middle of PA that maybe have never even met a trans person before, right? And so just really, you know, checking in with staff and seeing, you know, where are we at now? How can we make this better? Do we need to bring in a training? Do we need to look into like local LGBTQ organizations and see what they recommend? So really just being very mindful of how to support your staff in supporting other people.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Leo. You mentioned something about the names of the organizations, and I did just want to put out there that all of the official PCADV member organizations, their local programs that provide domestic violence services, regardless of the name, will help folks of any gender, any sexuality, no matter what. So even if their name, even if the word woman or women's is in the name of that program, that program will still provide services for LGBTQ survivors and for male straight cis male survivors as well. Anybody who is a survivor can seek services from PCA programs. And Mallory, I'm assuming that it could, or Rachel, the same thing for PCAR.
Yeah, and definitely also for our program specifically too, for legal representation as well.
Wonderful. Yeah. And if you are a survivor out there who's watching right now, if you go to pcadv.org/find-help, and we can drop that link in the chat, but you can find your local program right on our website. A lot of the programs are dual programs, so you can select by that on our website to see if it's also a sexual assault program, meaning it's one of PCAR's programs as well. I don't know if you want to mention any kind of, is there anywhere that folks can go to find the list of the PCAR programs if they're looking for sexual assault specific services?
You can go to pcar.org, pcar.org, and right on the homepage, there's a button you can click, and there's a handy map that does county by county. And if it's a dual center that does domestic violence and sexual assault, it'll list that one. And if it's specifically one just for sexual assault survivors, it will just list that one.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel. And speaking of the sexual assault side of things, I know that we've been talking here with Leo a lot specifically about the domestic violence, the IPV side of things. So is there anything that any of the three of you would want to add when it comes to working with and serving survivors of sexual assault that isn't intimate partner violence based?
Mallory, do you have anything specific to add?
I think it's all very much the same as what Leo had said. I mean, a lot of times we find that these are intertwined with each other, whether or not people actually say that or disclose that, or whether people are even aware that that's the case. They are a lot of times hand in hand with each other. So I think everything that Leo had said is really very much the same for us. Rachel, did you have anything else to add?
Just that my experience so far kind of dictates that all of the traditional stereotypes and assumptions, and then the worst of the worst that you know already exist for survivors of sexual assault, get compounded by stereotypical assumptions that get layered on when it comes to same-sex partners. So, I know Leo touched on that, but, when the police interact with folks, it is an added layer of what can already be quite a stigmatizing and horrible conversation to have.
Thanks for that perspective. I also wanted to ask more specifically about working with teens in this capacity. Teen dating violence and sexual assault also affect young people of all genders and sexual identities. I know, Leo, that you've had some experience with this. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you have done with LGBTQ youth to prevent teen dating violence and sexual assault?
Yeah, sure. So previous to being the LGBTQ outreach advocate for the Women's Center, I worked as an education facilitator. So I was kind of doing some work in the Pittsburgh public schools and talking to teens specifically about dating violence. And a lot of what I have done is really just having conversations with kids and asking them, what they already know about relationships, right? And asking them like, what do you think of when I say the word consent? Or what comes to mind? How would you define toxicity, right, in a relationship? Do toxicity and unhealthy relationships have crossover? They do. But like what does that look like to you? And just really having conversations about these things that they don't always have the space to talk about. And I think that's especially true with LGBTQIA kiddos, especially if parents aren't, super supportive of their identities. It's going to be really difficult to have those really kind of intimate conversations. And so I think that I've done my best to kind of just be somebody that can be trusted, right? Another queer person who it can be trusted and can have those conversations with people. I've done a little bit of support group facilitation. And I've done some work with Proud Haven in Pittsburgh. They're a really great organization that works with youth and homelessness. But that's kind of, just really talking to them and, talking about why, what does this look like to you? What do your relationships look like now? How might that change as you get older? And just, it's a time for kind of starting to build on identity. So it's important just to have the space to talk about it.
I love, awesome, Leo, that you said that you just like hold space for them to share and like talk to somebody that they feel like they can talk to. And I think a lot of times we forget that teens are exploring. They're trying to figure themselves out, whether that's in a healthy way, unhealthy way. I mean, they have these questions. They're listening to music that says things about domestic violence or sexual assault that becomes normal to them, or they're watching TV shows that depict it, but they don't always have that space to talk to somebody about it or be like, oh my gosh, I saw this. What is this? Is this normal? Is this how it's supposed to look? So I think that's really important, like just having that space. And I know sometimes it's hard when you have a curricula or you go into a school and you're told that this is what you have to do, but sometimes you can find those little like spots of like, oh, wait, we can expand this conversation more, or, oh, we're getting a lot of questions here. Let's focus on this. I know I have to get to this eventually, but like I can put that in there, and giving them that space, because I don't think a lot of people do. And I think it's needed. Like we were all teens, or we are teens, right? And we're still figuring it out. And it was hard. And I think just having someone just be listening is a really great step.
Yeah, totally agreed. I think it can be really easy to kind of like prescribe teenagers to this, like, oh well, you're just teenagers, you don't know what you're talking about. But you know, they're people too. They're humans who have their own autonomy, and they need to understand that they have their own autonomy, and that, you know, they see all of these like really difficult things happening in the world around them, right? Or they see like all of the, you know, reports on sexual assault, and they look at the Me Too movement, right? They've grown up in the Me Too movement, and, you know, still not maybe understanding the like nuances of like, you know, what does it mean to have your consent breached, right? Like what in completion, like what does that mean? And you know, what can we define as sexual assault, and how does that define how you learn and interact with the world, but also just, you know, your future personhood too. So it's, yeah, it's definitely super important.
Yeah, I think too, sometimes as adults, like we like underestimate kids and teens a little bit and think that they can't handle talking about certain topics or getting into like heavier things. And really, I think that they need that, especially with a trusted adult who can help guide them and like maybe provide them with some answers or at least some guidance. And so I agree with Mallory that I that space is so key, because it's often not given to kids, because we do tend to underestimate them.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Go ahead, Lauren. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, you know, like, and you know, we don't really at least like from what I know of what I had when I was in school and what I've heard from friends of mine who have kids that are now in school, you know, like sex education isn't really like super thorough and great, even for cis straight kids, let alone for LGBTQ youth. And so if you're not like getting that from the main curriculum in a school, I think it's great that there's other folks and organizations out there that are helping to provide this to the kids who really need it the most and give that space to them.
I think,
yeah,
sorry,
and there's
sorry,
like there are big conversations that need to be had, but you don't have to throw it all on a kid, right? Like you can do bite-sized chewies and just like leave little breadcrumbs for them, and then they'll come back. And I think that's the important part, like showing that, hey, I know you have a lot of questions. Where do you want to start? And then just doing like bare minimum, or just like, here's a highlight reel, go with that. And then they'll learn like, hey, I can have these questions for you, or I can come and talk to you about these things and learn more and more and more. The world is hard and heavy, but like kids need to know. Not every child has the ability to not hear what's going on, right? So I think it's unfair to just be like, oh, well, they can have this, or they get this, or, you know, whatever it might be. I think it's just finding a way to say the things without giving them like all the information at once, but just also saying like, hey, I'm here when and if you have more questions.
Yeah, I also think, to bring it back to this context where we are limiting where these kinds of things can be talked about, and said that what I think, while it's great for us to hold that space, I think it means we have to work extra hard to create and maintain those spaces, because functionally what you do when you shut down avenues of discussion in a space that is relatively open, where the teachers are all pretty much mandated reporters, this, that, and the other, that like you are now, they're not going to stop looking for that space. They're not going to stop asking those questions. They have the same questions regardless of whether or not you let them ask. And at the margins, I think it's dangerous. The places they may seek out those answers may not be where we want them to go from a safety perspective or whatever. So, you know, it's rough, but I think that means that we all do have to double down our efforts to hold open those spaces.
Sorry, I was still on mute. Rachel, you just gave me such a great transition. I'm going to shift our discussion a little bit and talk about some of the things that are going on in the land of policy and legislation in Pennsylvania right now that I think tie into what Rachel was just talking about. So currently there's 2 bills that have been introduced in the PA legislature that would fall under a don't say gay bill type of category that would limit what schools and educators can provide to students. And SB 1277 is one that would require schools to adopt a policy of notifying parents of sexually explicit materials available or taught in the school and options to provide alternatives to the child. And SB 1278 would bar teacher-led instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation in grades pre-K through 5. Currently, both of those bills have passed out of the Senate and have been referred to the House Education Committee. So they are not laws yet, they are still just in the process. But I wanted to ask and talk about with all of you, what might be some of the impacts that you could see this type of legislation having both on LGBTQ students in Pennsylvania and also educators in PA if they would happen to be signed into law?
I mean, I think the most obvious thing is the chilling effect that it has on teachers, which go, these laws, whether we think they're constitutionally valid or not, and whether there's a Supreme Court interested in constitutional, issues or not, they still stop people from saying something because you get targeted as a subject of someone who's being scrutinized under one of these policies, online or whatever, and nobody really wants to bring that on themselves or their families. So you just don't say anything. You don't talk about it, and you over censor yourself too, beyond what might actually be required. I think both bills are ridiculous. I think that 1278, which is about parental notification, parental rights, vis-a-vis not talking about sexual orientation. In particular, it clearly has the thumbprints of the same people that wrote the one in Florida. It's got sentences that are borderline identical. I think it's super suspect in terms of potentially just creating a situation where kids might be subject to abuse at home. I think that's pretty clear to anybody with, who's reading it. So yeah, for me, that's the big sort of outcome here. I don't know if you guys feel similarly or
Yeah,
I hope that these don't get passed into law, but obviously it did in Florida. And, I think it's just worth noting too, to circle back to Leo, what you were saying earlier about the statistics we don't have already on this stuff, where you look at SB 1278 and think about section 1406C, which talks about surveys and how parents are supposed to be notified of any health survey, which would include basic demographic collection here that we're talking about. It's not going to help gather statistics so that you are even more restricted in being able to address those populations, because now the state is intentionally pretending they don't exist, right? So, and then, if I can, the only other thing I'll point about this set of 2 bills is that the sponsor of 1277, Ryan Aument, it's worth noting here that most of his financing came from school choice proponents, school choice folks. And so I think there's a very direct line there from these laws to people who don't really actually think public school is a public right in this country. And so they don't really care what this does to demoralize teachers at the end of the day.
Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. Yeah, PCADV is also concerned about these 2 pieces of legislation for all of the reasons you just said. one of the things that we had talked about too was with the parental notification things, does this take away a potential trusted adult that previously a kid might have felt comfortable disclosing their sexual or gender identity to, or talking about them with, what they're going through and what they're experiencing as they're figuring their life out, but now they might be there might be a forced outing of them to the parent potentially. Is that something that you could see this bill doing? Is that concern something that you've come across?
I mean, I have that concern. I don't know. I think, Leo, you probably have much more experience on the ground, and I don't have a ton of experience in Pennsylvania schools, except to say that if you have an administration that is already on board with these kinds of policies and procedures, where they really want to get heavy into notifying parents of all this stuff, then you probably also have an administration that's relatively hostile to these youth in the first place. And so they're going to feel more isolated, especially if they can't come out at home, would be my guess.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think, it's like any of these bills that are serving to block specific identities, right, from just existing. At the end of the day, like the really simple, this is not a good thing, is that queer and trans kids are not going to stop being queer and trans. They're just going to be very, very sad, or and therefore, may lead to self-harm and worse, right? Or the homelessness because parents kick them out, right? They're not going to stop being who they are just because we cut off that avenue, right? And so it's just going to really lead to that isolation. It's going to lead to the people who want to help and want to do the work having less access to the people they want to help, right? And so yeah, Rachel, I agree with everything that you've said so far.
Yeah, well, and also less resources too. I mean, we talked about when we were talking about the lack of research and those folks being identified, like a school's not going to be able to set aside resources for a population that they're not allowed to talk about the existence of, so I think that's a big concern as well. Like there's already not a lot of resources to go around, and then to remove that even further potentially, I think is also dangerous for these kids and for the teachers that it impacts too.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this morning, and it's what, 3 pages long, SB 1277. So you're talking about something that's just not particularly fleshed out in terms of what it's trying to ban. But if you're educating on sexual assault, is that sexually explicit information? And can I talk about it? Because he's talking about any depictions, visual or otherwise, of sexual conduct, explicit written descriptions. So how do you teach about these things when you aren't even allowed to have materials that reference them? And if you do, you could get sued. I mean, we're asking a school librarian to take inventory of every book and every single word in that book and notify parents if any of it talks about sex. That's it's a huge project, and they're already not paid enough, I'm sure. So I think number one, I don't see a scenario in which someone does not, either intentionally or not, as with some of these laws, you intentionally violate it to then challenge it. But I just don't see a scenario where someone somewhere is not kind of violating it and then potentially risking a parent suing. And for better or worse, if the state's going to uphold the law, the place to challenge it is a 14th Amendment due process claim, most likely. And, I don't really like my chances there either. So,
yeah, it's a tough climate in which to have to challenge something like this. And, hopefully there'll be something in PA that we don't end up with these rules in place. And Rachel, I did want to clarify 1277, the one that's about explicit sexual materials that you were just speaking of, that one is for all grades, correct? And then the 1278, which bars teacher-led instruction on gender identity and sexual orientation, that one is just K through 5.
That's right. The sexually explicit materials, I believe, is all grades. I'm glancing at it now just to double check that. And then through grade 8, materials that, so there's one, sexually explicit conduct includes materials that contain visual depictions of nudity accessible to minors in kindergarten through grade 8. And then I think for all grades, it would be depictions of sexual conduct or written descriptions of sexual conduct. So that's bizarre. And then the other one has the similar distinctions as the Florida law, which breaks it out K through 5. You're not allowed to talk about it at all, I believe. And then 6th through 12th grade, age appropriate manner, developmentally appropriate in accordance with state standards, whatever they may be.
So, yeah. So potential impacts for LGBTQ youth and really for all kids, because this will affect, like you said, sexual assault education. It'll affect sex ed, like general sex ed. It'll affect teen dating violence prevention efforts, all of those things that we're working on to make students safer, more aware, have healthy relationships and understand what healthy and unhealthy relationships are, understand consent. Like it'll make it much more difficult to talk to kids about these things. And it's really important to talk to kids about these things when they're young, because we know that rates of domestic violence and sexual assault are higher in young adults than any other age group. And so if we're not preparing them for that, that's only gonna cause harm for folks. I did also just wanna ask about the HB 972, which was the bill that has now passed both the House and the Senate, excluding transgender girls and women from sports. Now, fortunately, Governor Wolf has promised to veto this bill, but Governor Wolf's coming to his end of term, and we're not sure who will be in office in the future. So I just wanted to get your thoughts as well, Rachel, on the legal implications of this, how it relates to Title IX, and what some of the impacts could be.
Yeah, I'm hoping it gets vetoed and sticks, but we've seen it play out in other places. And unfortunately, while I think these laws are obviously wrong and unconstitutional, this issue is one that even if you can get someone to say they support trans folks or trans rights, for some reason the sports context confuses them. And so, and it applies to all schools pretty much. And I have to assume that what you're looking at is a situation where maybe trans folks are only allowed to play, quote, co-ed sports, but it's interesting to me that it applies at the collegiate level, even though when they argue these laws, they argue about they want girls to be able to compete on an even playing field, and they don't, want them to be outcompeted, whatever language they use that's usually offensive. They've also included intramural sports and the kinds of things where it's not the top athletes who are competing and playing, the kinds of things I would have done, and I'm absolutely not athletic in college. And so it gives away the game a little bit there too. And I think, when it comes to Title IX, I think it's pretty clearly a violation of it, but yet again, I don't like my odds at the Supreme Court, and that's where you've got to go with it. But these are the kind of cases not sports cases specifically, but discrimination cases under Title IX that relate to sexual assault we take. And Title IX is a behemoth. Schools already don't know how to comply with it. Adding layers to that the state is trying to add on is going to make it harder for schools to comply. So even if I give them all the credit and good faith in the world, I don't think they're able to comply because the regulations are such a winding maze. And so yeah, I it's not gonna be easy for anyone. And so again, I can't imagine scenario where you're like it's not being regularly violated. And the last thing I'll say, and I was listening to Jillian Brandstetter talk about this issue of sports, and it's people, she said it very well, it's people legislating about a black box within a black box, because these people don't watch women's sports in the first instance, and they also don't, they don't know what they're talking about in terms of how many trans athletes there actually are. I think in one instance in Utah or something, there were like 4 total in the whole state. So it's a piece of legislation targeting about 10 or fewer people, which to me just is really horrifying to think about the state engaging in that activity.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Rachel. And I mean, the whole premise of this is based on something that's not really a problem, even because even when trans athletes are allowed to participate in whichever sports programming that they want to and like feel comfortable with and identify with, they don't dominate. It's not like it's like destroying chances for women to compete if a trans woman competes in the same sport. Like we haven't even really seen that. So they're pretending to like solve a problem that isn't even a problem about something that they don't watch or understand. And really it's just a way to target a population that they want to marginalize further. And it's sad to see. And just for folks, I would give a little bit of background before we get into this. Title IX is the federal civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex, and that includes sexual orientation and gender identity in education programs or other activities that receive financial assistance, government financial assistance. So that's why this applies directly to schools, to colleges, and some other programming like that. And Title IX has been great. It actually just reached its 50th anniversary mark. So hopefully it will stand and keep protecting folks in educational settings. And so, obviously the climate right now in Pennsylvania and across the United States has been scary when it comes to anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans legislations. And I just wanted to ask, what kind of impacts have you seen this having on kids in the LGBTQ community? What kind of impacts has it been having on the broader LGBTQ community? And have you seen any impacts on specifically survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual assault because of the current climate?
They're scared. That's like, honestly, that's the biggest thing. They're scared. They can remember, most of them can remember, when just like marriage equality was passed into effect, right? And so now they're watching a lot of hypocrisy happen, right? They're watching a lot of really awful things and bills being passed through the government, and people not supporting them and very clearly trying to violate their bodies and their identities, and they're scared. I mean, it's kind of, I'm almost 30 years old. I'm scared. It's like, what does the future look like for those people, right? It's like, what, where is safe? And doing a lot of like having a lot of fear around like, well, where can I go that is safe? I don't have the money to go where it's safe. It's yeah, there's a lot of layers to it. There's just yeah.
So we don't end on a too low of a note. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what can folks do if they're listening today, if they want to learn more or get involved in advocating for LGBTQ survivors, if they want to help LGBTQ youth. Maybe there's a parent or a teacher out there who, maybe wants to reach out to somebody to access some of the services that you were talking about, Leo, to, where that there is a space for LGBTQ youth to talk and have those conversations. So how can folks that are listening today get involved and take action?
I think PFLAG is a really great place to start. PFLAG is an organization that they kind of support and provide information for queer folks, but also parents and families specifically. So it's actually set up to help, parents or guardians or siblings or whoever that might be to kind of transition into like real allyship, right? And so PFLAG's really great. Their website they have chapters all over the place. So their website has like a find your chapter location. So that's a good place to kind of look for any, like if there are LGBTQ community centers in your area or people who are kind of pretty open about saying that they support LGBTQ folks in whatever capacity that is, right? Whatever service that is. Find support groups, talk to those facilitators of support groups, find, queer therapists or social workers and just talk to people, right? Ask questions. And, people are going to tell you whether or not those are the right questions to be asking. Pay attention to local legislation and things like that. Policy is super important right now.
And I will add, because on a similar note, we forget in the state the extent to which our local elected officials and school boards have power over us and our children. And that is a place where your own advocacy actually goes a really long way. So showing up at a school board meeting and showing up for that town council meeting can have a big impact. So those are places that are typically accessible, especially during COVID. Some of them switched to having online stuff. I don't know if they still do. And honestly, I think if you can't expect the protections you want from the top, building them from the ground up is one potential avenue that you can exploit that can be impactful. And, when you go into the voting booth, maybe you don't think it matters who's the president, but it has so much bigger impact on who you vote for school board if you care about certain issues. So definitely worth keeping tabs on.
Mallory, do you have anything else that folks need to take action or any final thoughts for us today?
No, I agree with what Leah and Rachel said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but anybody can run for school board. So if you're passionate about something, or if you want to see changes in your school district, go for it. If you have the time, if you have the capacity, if that's what you want to do, any single person can go ahead and do that. And I think just educating yourself, finding the resources that you need and getting the information and reaching out to the people if you need more information or want to talk about it more.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today and having this conversation. I know it was a bit of a heavy one, but we really, really, really appreciate your expertise, your personal experience and opinions. So I really can't thank y'all enough for being here today so that we could have this really important
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see y'all next time on the next Ask an Advocate. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye.